the Yanqui Menace during the Cold War era. This title is inspired to a certain degree by a lament written into 2 centuries of Mexican history, so far from God, so close to the United States. That is the tragedy of Mexican history. So, on a broader scale, looking at Latin America during the Cold War, we're going to be looking largely at political history. What were the lenses through which the United States looked at Latin America? In what ways did it try to influence Latin American politics? And to what extent did Latin American elites try to exploit the United States anti-communist anxieties for their own political purposes? Now, I don't want to go into an extensive amount of detail on U.S. foreign policy relative to Latin America over the last 200 years, but it's important to understand that the United States has always looked at Latin America through a special lens, and that is essentially the idea of Latin America as the United States' backyard. In other words, it's very close to the United States, geographically speaking, and in some way it asserts some kind of proprietary ownership over this space. That somehow countries like Mexico are not as independent or free from U.S. influence as European states are, at least from an American point of view. And to some degree, this original idea goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States tried to assert this idea that the Western Hemisphere was special from old Europe, these countries that were many centuries old. The Western Hemisphere was a new world where democracy would reign, and the United States had a special role to fill. It was really only during the late 19th century, really even 1900, where the United States started to really exercise a major influence over the governments of particularly Central America. This was often called dollar diplomacy because often the form of interference was sending in U.S. Marines to reassert the property rights of American investors that had been essentially their assets were confiscated by Latin American populists that wanted the land and resources and labor of the region to go to their own peoples. It was only during the Great Depression that there was this kind of brief interlude of a decade where Franklin Roosevelt, preoccupied with the United States' own affairs, asserted this good neighbor policy and essentially a more laissez-faire attitude that they would not in this way essentially exercise informal imperialism and essentially overthrow Latin American nationalist regimes that threatened their business interests. But during the Cold War, American-style imperialism kind of got a new varnish. A new chapter was written where the role of the United States military and security establishment to ensure stability in Latin America was now also focused on eradicating communism. Now, the excuse is that all communism came from Moscow. But in fact, most of the socialists and land reformers, the political left in Latin America, had only a tangential small connection to the Soviet Union. Most of it was really homegrown. Most of it was really rooted in an inequitable division of land and resources. So in that sense, the political left was not an external force inspired by Moscow, but it was mostly a organic outgrowth of the inequality of the region. Now, in the 1960s, the United States became much more heavily involved in Latin American politics. First, the Alliance of Progress, they tried to promote democracy, but with the passing of Kennedy, during the Vietnam War under Johnson and Nixon. The Alliance for Progress was really, essentially changed 180 degrees to really being a tool for attacking the political left in Latin America, which was associated with a destabilizing force, a force that was hostile to American businesses. The context of Cuba was one important pivot point in this particular policy. And it wasn't really until the 1980s when Latin American military governments, these junta, really ran out of steam and popularity, that the United States again reverted back to a more positive policy and tried to promote economic reform and democratic reform. And many military regimes fell, and democratic states sought consensus with the United States in building essentially a more neoliberal economy. So the point being is that the United States over the last 200 years has exercised a very major role in the history of Latin American politics. It believes that it is entitled to interfere into the sovereignty of these states. It believes that this interference, even the overthrow of these regimes, is a legitimate exercise of its power. That the United States has a moral responsibility to maintain hemispheric security. And as a result, Latin American states, their politics, has been in very major ways intersected with U.S. foreign policy, particularly during the Cold War, when the United States was very antsy about communism and was willing to support very brutal dictators, the tactics of state terrorism, as we will see, in order to ensure that communism didn't establish a toehold in the Western Hemisphere. So I've assigned a little video that kind of gives you a capsule of what happened in Guatemala. I'm just going to highlight some of the main features of this story because it really is a golden exemplar of how the United States informal empire in Latin America worked. So Guatemala was the quintessential banana republic. And what we mean by that was not only was its economy based largely on the exports of bananas, a tropical fruit, to the United States, but one single U.S. economy, the Boston Fruit Company, later called the United Fruit Company, was really the dominant political and economic force within this country. They owned most of the land. They owned pretty much all the railroad, all the port infrastructure. They employed a lot of the people, and they had their own, essentially police force. They were essentially a state within the state. They exercised tremendous influence over the government of Guatemala to the extent that it really had very little independence. It was, essentially the United Fruit Company was the voice behind the throne. And if they didn't like what the legislator was doing in Guatemala City, they would let their displeasure be known, and they could even ensure that these politicians were removed. So in that sense, it was a banana republic. In other words, it was sovereign in name, but not in reality. So there was a reformist politician named Arbenz, Jacobo Arbenz, who was a former colonel. He ran as a reformist politician. He ran on a program of land reform where he would buy unused land at a market price and then redistribute it to landless peasants. So this was a very popular measure. He had a great deal of support. Over 60% of the population voted for him, largely on the basis of this reform measure. behind it as well was, of course, the idea of Guatemala becoming an independent state and kind of exercising an authority, the government exercising an authority for the people, rather than being a appendage of the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company didn't like it, although they weren't the only company whose land was targeted for expropriation. They did own a lot of the good land, and they didn't feel that the price that was offered was fair, even though it was the price that they had declared for purposes of paying their taxes. So they let arbenz know. They weren't happy about it when arbenz ignored them. They went to Washington, where they were able to tap a law firm that had John Foster Dulles on the payroll. And John Foster Dulles had been, under Eisenhower, the foreign secretary, the Secretary of State, and his brother happened to be the CIA director, Allen Dulles. So anyways, they had pretty powerful, protectors for them in Washington. So Washington sent an envoy, an ambassador by the name of John Purifoy, to talk to arbenz to have him essentially cease and desist with this land reform measure. And arbenz, had the, the temerity to actually argue with Purifoy that, this was not communist. This is simply a democratic measure. It was very popular. And he tried to explain why he was doing it. And he said, I'm inspired by the founding fathers of the United States. I'm not a communist. I'm a Christian socialist. And Purifoy said, no, I don't want to hear any of that. You stop messing with United Fruit or there'll be trouble. And essentially this is called the bullet in the briefcase approach. First you try diplomatic pressure. And if that doesn't work, essentially the United States would go to the shadows and remove you, either by assassination or essentially working in the shadows to overthrow your regime through a coup. So the United States, through various means then from 1953 to 1954, did remove Jacobo Arbenz. The capsule explains some of the tools that were used for this purpose, and the story of what happened to Jacobo Arbenz was, in a sense, one that was replayed throughout Latin America and various places like Chile and Argentina, where the United States removed left-wing leaders that threatened American businesses. So in looking at this Arbenz example, I think the critical question we have to ask is, why was Arbenz seen as such a threat? He wasn't really allied to the Soviet Union. There was no danger of a Soviet base coming to the Western Hemisphere. Why did they paint him as a communist threat, a tool for Moscow, and remove him since he was democratically elected? Isn't the United States supposed to be, pro-democratic? And the basic two reasons that you can see are, one, that they didn't really care that he was a Christian socialist. His policies were threatening the United Fruit Company, and they somehow used communist containment as an excuse to promote American business interests. Or another argument would be that from the United States point of view, even if Arbenz wasn't necessarily directly connected to the Soviet Union, he did have communists in his cabinet. He, by confiscating property, was showing that he was a dangerous radical. His government could come under the influence of communists. So in that sense, it was justified to remove him from power, even if he was democratically elected. So in other words, from your point of view, looking at this example, what do you think? Was it really strategic concerns, communist containment that really directed the United States to remove Arbenz, or was essentially the Cold War communist containment just an excuse, kind of a stalking horse for American business interests? That American business interests use the security established, the CIA, as an appendage to extend their private economic interests. So if we step back a bit and watch the Cold War in Latin America over a longer period of time, over this 20-year period from say the removal of Arbenz to essentially the banking crisis of the early 1980s, what we would see is that across Latin America, generally reformist regimes, corporative regimes that were focused on building the welfare state, trying to expand exports, trying to take over private businesses and put the wealth of the state for the benefit of ordinary people. What you would see is that these reformer regimes were running into trouble, economic trouble in terms of not being able to direct growth and improve the living standards of the rural poor and the urban poor, the urban working classes. As a result, there was a increase in the political left. The political left, especially during the early 1960s, started to mobilize landless peasants, trade unionists in cities, students that were reading Marxism, were starting to form left-wing parties that were essentially advocating for a major structural reform of Latin American society to address the fundamental inequalities of landholding and wealth. And the response of the Latin American elites was to fight the political left, largely by invoking the military to step in, to overthrow the regime or to take over the reins of power so that the military could be used as a tool, not for national defense, but to essentially crush the political left that was threatening to redistribute the economic pie. So the era from 1960s and 1970s was the rise of the junta and the establishment of martial law to crush the political left in various states. And the story in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, these were all different names, different periods, but the general story was the same. These right-wing regimes overthrew democratic government. They established martial law. The military, using the language of the Cold War, declared their enemies communists, and they used brutal counterinsurgency tactics that included torture, murder, intimidation to crush their political opponents. In this process, they were often implicitly or explicitly allied with the United States, which offered them diplomatic cover, offered them logistical support through the CIA, offered them weapons in order to crush their political opponents that the United States saw as a threat to Western security, and also, of course, as a threat to American business interests. Now, in terms of the individual states, of course, the history of Argentina and Brazil are going to be different. I can't go over the detail of these particular states, but if you think about this model, kind of these four factors were coming together in various ways. The military officers inside the armies in Latin America had this national security doctrine, which they had been trained in, which led the officers to believe that they were the sacred guardians of the republic. So it was their patriotic duty to overthrow the Constitution and crush the political left, which they defined as a security threat to the state, not just their class interests. Certainly the Cuban Revolution played a role because the United States became very antsy about left-wing Latin American left-wing politics, and they became a lot more draconian in terms of supporting military regimes, even ones that significantly violated the human rights of their citizens. It was certainly an era of the Cold War where the United States provided support to regimes that declared themselves as anti-communist, regardless of the atrocities they might be committing. And there was a longer tradition in Latin America of political instability and of chapters when during political instability of the military taking over. So in some sense, the rise of the junta was a continuation of a longer story, a deeper history in Latin American history that went back all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars and the birth of these republics in the early 19th century. Now, you might be asking yourself, why did the United States side with these brutal dictators that, tortured their people rather than the landless peasants that were arguing for democracy and human rights? And, the United States provided various rationales, essentially, for their support for brutal dictators like Pinochet. So one was given, in Kennedy during his address during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that communism really punishes its own people the most because it's a dictatorial system and inefficient economics. It's a tyrannical system. So we can't be naive in a Cold War battlefield. The United States sometimes has to make ugly alliances because the alternative communism would be worse, at least from the United States point of view. One argument used was that if the United States allowed communism to take hold in places like Guatemala, soon the Soviet Union would be able to establish a beachhead, bring in destroyers, agents, and this would spread communism throughout the region like a bunch of falling dominoes. The United States also asserted during the Cold War their old traditional argument that they were the sacred defenders of democracies in the Western Hemisphere. This was their backyard. So they were doing it essentially to protect not just the people that were under a communist regime, but to protect other Latin American states that couldn't defend themselves. So the United States was doing this for, sacrificing for the good of the whole. One of the things you could see in Guatemala is that the United States was really looking at the world in black and white terms, right? So, the fact that Jacobo Arbenz was a Christian socialist made no difference. It didn't make any difference that he didn't have any tangible ties to Moscow. If you were left-wing, if you were Allende, Arbenz, and you were doing land reform, expropriating property, well, then you were a communist, and communism meant that you attracted the attention of the U.S. security establishment, and they would remove you one way or another. And I guess the final thing we could say is Johnson said this and it kind of is, to me, summarizes the Machiavellian logic of the Cold War. He might be an SOB, a son of a bitch, but he's my SOB, and this was essentially a way of saying that during the Cold War, sometimes we have to make messy alliances. These states aren't perfect. But we need to make sure that communism doesn't proliferate in Latin America, because it would create a whole host of other problems. So this becomes essentially an excuse for cozying up to brutal dictators that were on the top of Amnesty International's list of human rights violators. Some very brutal figures that were responsible for torturing thousands, killing thousands of their own citizens, often with U.S. support, both informal and formal. So in some ways we can look at someone like Reagan, who was definitely a Cold Warrior. We can see this mentality of the United States. The national security of all the Americas is at stake in Central America. So we're going to support these contra-terrorists that are attacking the Sandinista regime, because it's the security of all of America that's at stake. If we cannot defend ourselves there, we cannot prevail elsewhere. So in other words, whatever the regime is in Nicaragua is somehow going to make a difference to the survival of apple pie in Alabama. Our credibility would collapse, our alliances would crumble, and the safety of our homeland would be put in jeopardy. So this is essentially the logic of the Cold War, the domino theory, that the political conflicts in very different distant regions somehow are existential for the survival of basic freedoms in the United States. Now, not everyone agreed with Reagan. You think William Fulbright, looking at the Dominican Revolution, where the United States crushed the democracy and sided with the military. He begins the process of American leftists starting to questioning the logic of the Cold War. It's like, well, what's going on here? Are we really defending democracy, or in supporting these dictators, are we promoting these left-wing forces for to rally for social justice? Maybe we should change our policy. There were kind of two lenses of looking at it. Do we crush the bad guys, or should we be promoting democratic reform in Latin America? And generally speaking, during the Cold War period, it's the darker voices that dominate the U.S. security establishment. Now, in terms of Latin America, I mentioned this in the lament at the beginning of Mexico. So far from God, so close to the United States. The United States is an economic hegemon. Even large economies like Brazil and Mexico are just a fractional size of the United States. So whether the United States is interfering in their politics or not, just the inequality in size means you can't have essentially a balanced relationship. The United States is so powerful that in a way you have to respect the hegemon, or else you start to feel the wrath. So what were the kind of tools through which the United States influenced Latin American politics? Well, one was simply economic assistance, right? So the United States is very powerful. For them, a few $1 million isn't a lot. But in the politics of Latin America, it's a lot. So they could essentially buy regime change in Guatemala for $3 million, which is a pittance. Another important venue for influence was diplomatic influence. The United States has this, essentially colonial organization of American states. It's a nice marble building in Washington, D.C., and it's supposed to be a forum where these states come together, but it's really the United States that calls the shots. So in the case of Cuba, for example, the United States would have its allies condemn Cuba and essentially banish it. Another way, a very powerful way that the United States influences Latin America, its informal empire, is by having very close relationships to Latin American elites. So, for example, Pinochet, before he overthrows the Allende government, he's the chief of staff, essentially, of the militaries. He asked the permission of the United States. Are you going to be okay if I do this? And the United States says, okay. So, the relationship of these various elites and the security establishment is very complicated. I can't go into all the details. Many of them, as young officers, came to Georgia to study in Fort Benning counterinsurgency strategy. In the process of this, they became very close to people in the U.S. security establishment, to the extent that they could sometimes call upon these relationships in launching their coups, or call on these chips when they were established in power, to deflect criticism if they were doing human rights abuses, for example. Another way that the United States exercised power was through economic warfare. So Chile, for example, the embargo, 90% of Cuban exports are going to the U.S. market. So the embargo is essentially, killing the economy with a sledgehammer. Chile as well, one of the things that Nixon said is, make the economy scream. So they essentially used economic pressure, covert pressure, to destabilize the Allende government, to make it possible for Pinochet to overthrow it. There's also, clandestine subversion. The case of arbenz, we can see this. They appoint Arbenz's successor, Armas, is trained by the CIA, is given an army, and then sent to invade. In Cuba, they tried a similar thing in the Bay of Pigs. And if all that fails, well, you still got direct invasion. They were going to do that in Cuba. The Soviet Union stopped them from doing it there. They did it in Panama, Haiti, and various times. Another tool which is used is essentially threats and bribery. So if you confiscate U.S. property, you'll get a visit from an economic hitman that tells you to reverse policy, or else they'll send in an assassin. James Bond, License to Kill. Latin American leaders were targeted for assassination. Castro over 600 times. If you didn't play by the rules, you would be eliminated. And the threat of that and the pressure of that was so great that, of course, a lot of Latin American leaders saw the light and understood it was a lot easier to play ball with the United States and be corrupt and accept the bribes than to stick to your values and face summary removal. So the word junta is essentially a military oligarchy which overthrows a civilian government, and instead of a prime minister and ministers, they're essentially supplanted by a ruling council of military officers. And these various admirals and colonels have various portfolios, like not just the military and foreign policy, but also housing, etc. So the junta, in taking over, not only supplanted democracy, but they also declared martial law, and finally they used the military as a bludgeon to crush their political opponents. So the junta and political violence were very intimately connected in the history of Latin America. We've already talked about some of these countries. Other ones are discussed in the textbooks to greater and lesser degrees. The junta could be both right and left, although the majority of the junta were the right wing. They were essentially members of elite Latin American families. They were acting and using the military for class interests to suffocate reform. The story of various countries is, of course, different, but one, prominent link is that the United States was often supporting, either formally or informally, these regimes, and therefore implicit in their crimes and human rights violations, including torture and murder. Now, using the military to crush your political opponents, that's political violence. But this was not just random violence. Chomsky has used the concept of state terrorism because violence was surgically applied with a political purpose. The purpose was to crush the political left and to intimidate them so that they would desist from asking for a redistribution of the economic pie. So what were the tactics that these junta used to greater or lesser degrees? So one of them was disappeared. They would use illegal militias, often secret police or army, out of uniform. They would show up in the middle of the night. They'd knock on your door. They would grab your son or daughter, who might be a trade union leader or a Marxist at the university, and they would just haul them away. And then, the next day when you go to the police station, you'd ask, well, where's my son? Where's my daughter? And the police lieutenant would say, well, I have no idea. They're not in the system. They had simply disappeared. And many of the people that were made to disappear were tortured. They were tortured in part to have them find their compatriots, their fellow leftists. In other cases, they were tortured simply as a means to break their spirit. Some very unsavory characters were involved with these junta, including former Nazis, members of the right-wing French movement that had been, on the wrong side of de Gaulle. Sometimes sadists, criminals were all involved in this violence. It was a very brutal regime. Now, most of the people that disappeared were never found again. They were, after being tortured for maybe 3 months, 6 months, many of them were simply killed and thrown into the river or thrown into the ocean by helicopter. This was an intimidation tactic. Obviously there's no closure, there's no body. The relatives would never know what happened to their son or daughter. Some would find out 30 or 40 years later from secret records. So this was a way to intimidate the political left and to crush the movement by taking its leaders and essentially eliminating them. Another tactic was death squads. So these would be essentially military battalions that would go into the countryside where there might be rebels operating, and they would just go in and kill every man, woman, and child inside a village if they believed that this village, or they had proof that this village was supporting the rebels. So it's a very famous example in El Salvador, Guatemala as well, of all villagers being killed, and this was to send a message to essentially the guerrillas to lay down their arms. They're willing to use incredible amounts of force and brutality in order to crush the resistance. Torture, as I said, became a staple of these regimes. It was used in a way to crush the spirit of the political left and also to intimidate their relatives not to join these movements. Rape was a frequent tool that was used. It's a way of degrading the individual, taking away their humanity. And we're not just talking women, although women were raped incessantly by their captors. Men as well were raped as a means to essentially humiliate them and to break their spirit. Obviously, arbitrary punishment is one thing. So, during Chile's 9/11 in 1973, thousands of people were arrested in Santiago. They were kind of huddled into the soccer stadium. Anyone that was spotted, believed to be a communist, a leftist, could be. There was no habeas corpus. They were just put in the stadium, and then they would research it a little bit more. Some people were released. Other people were sent to prison camps. Other people were killed and tortured. So essentially what martial law is essentially your civil rights are suspended, your constitutional rights are suspended. There's a curfew. You can be arrested for anything, held indefinitely. You don't have right to judicial due process. This is essentially the legal system being bent to serve the process of state terrorism and to destroy the political left. So I think state terrorism is a pretty good concept that really captures the mentality and the philosophy of political violence. And here you can see very famous Latin American officers like Iberico Saint Jean that are very clear that violence was a tool for intimidation. They were using force. They were using the military. They were using counterinsurgency tactics, not to defend themselves from a foreign threat, but their internal opponents were labeled as enemies, labeled as communists, and they justified this violence as purging this evil force to save the soul of the nation. They saw themselves as, they certainly, whether they believed it or not, they called themselves patriots, and they used this to justify a brutal repression of the political left. And they were largely successful in this, at least in crushing the left until their own regimes faltered in the wake of the major banking crisis. So to summarize this lecture, the United States looked at Latin America through a special lens. This was the Western Hemisphere. This was our backyard. So the United States had a long history of interfering into this region and essentially usurping the sovereignty of Latin American states. They viewed these Latin American states as banana republics, weak, needing U.S. protection. And during the Cold War, this basically continued in, essentially a new chapter where, communism was the enemy, and the United States sided with Latin American elites against the political left. What really got the politics, determined the politics of this region, was that the ISI program had really run out of steam, and as the political left mobilized, it was the political right that used the military and martial law to crush their opponents. And the United States, in various ways, supported these regimes, either diplomatically or logistically, or in terms of economic assistance, because this was the Cold War era. And the United States, at least a majority of the security establishment, the majority of the political class, the majority of the American people, supported these policies that resulted in very large human rights violations.